In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to work an Afterthought heel, but where the Afterthought heel is created by striping different yarns. This is a fun pair of socks I've made, where essentially the cuff, the toe, and the heels are all alternating. And the yarn I'm going to be showing you on today is a self-striping yarn. So what I'm going to take you through is first, it's an Afterthought heel. So we're going to place a piece of waste yarn as we're knitting the sock. So you're going to knit the cuff, knit the full leg of the sock, place your waste yarn, so skip over the heel basically, continue knitting all the way up through the foot and the toe, and then we come back for that waste yarn we've placed at the heel, and we start working that heel. So you really can follow any sock pattern that you'd like. I have a few that I can link up here in the corner in my playlist, and I'll also be sure to link the video that I have that shows just how to do a regular Afterthought heel as well, in case you don't want to do the striping version. So over here in my little sample, what I've done so far is I started off with 1x1 ribbing, then I switched to 3x1 ribbing, and now this little bar of pink is where I've placed in my heel. And what you want to make sure of is you want to think about how large the heel is going to be once you add it in. That way that'll be like the total length of your cuff here. So the heel, let me get out a tape measure here, adds in just about 2 inches. So wherever you place your waste yarn, to the bottom of the heel, it's going to add on about 2 inches. So on my sample over here, what I'm going to do is, now that I've knit up to the same location, I'm going to show you how to place the waste yarn. So for placing the waste yarn, it doesn't matter what type of knitting needles you're knitting with. If you're working with double pointed, a big magic loop, or these smaller circular ones, all we're going to be doing is knitting across half of however many stitches you've total cast on, and then we're going to slip those stitches back over to the other knitting needle. And as we're knitting these stitches, we want to use a piece of waste yarn. So you want to use also another weight of yarn that's the same as your sock yarn. So I'm just knitting this out of a fingering weight yarn. So this is also fingering weight yarn. And you want to make sure it has a bit of like a slippier texture. That way it's easier to pick up and slip out of your work later on. So to start off, I'm going to knit with this piece of waste yarn where I want to place my heel across half of my stitches. So I'm just going to join it right in. And it doesn't matter what the pattern of your sock is, like I was doing a 3x1 ribbing, just knit all the way across half of your stitches. Okay, now that I've knit across half my stitches, I'm going to take my piece of waste yarn and I'm going to cut it. I usually leave about an 8 to 10 inch tail here. And I'm just going to tuck that yarn tail into the inside of my sock. Now what I want to do is I want to take all these stitches that I just knit and pass them back over to my left knitting needle. So I actually find this is easier if I turn my work and just look at the inside of my sock. So I'm going to pass each one of those stitches back over. Now I'm back at the beginning of the round, so I'm going to turn my work. Now I can just continue working with my sock yarn for the foot of the sock. So something to keep in mind is where you just place those waste yarn stitches, that's going to be the bottom of your foot, right? Your heel is going to go right here. So looking at one of these sample socks, where you just place those waste yarn stitches, right, is going to represent this bottom half of the stitches. So if you're working any sort of pattern across the top of your foot, you just want to make sure you do it on the opposite side, where you didn't just place those waste yarn stitches. Another thing to keep in mind is thinking about how far you want to work for. So your foot and your toe, that should be just about 2 inches short of the total length you would like your sock. That way when you come back and put in your heel, you'll have the perfect length of a sock, adding in those 2 inches. So I'm going to continue working all the way up through the foot and the toe of my sock, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we add in these stripes for the heel. Now that I have my full sock knit without the heel, my next step is going to be to pick up the stitches around that piece of waste yarn I placed. How I want to start is I want to put my sock in the direction of the knitting. So I started at the cuff and I went up towards the toe. Cuff is closest to me, toe is furthest away. And here I'm going to zoom in as much as I can. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to pick up the right side of each one of the V's just below the waste yarn. And the way you can make sure you're picking up the right number of those V's is you want to pick up the exact same number as half of your total number of stitches. For example, here I've cast on 68 stitches, so I'm going to be picking up 34 of those half V's as I go across this first side. So you want to find where your waste yarn starts, and then see how your waste yarn makes each one of these V's here? You want to go just below that and pick up the right side of the V. Then you're going to skip the left side, go to the next stitch, pick up just the right side. Skip the left, pick up just the right. And I'm going to keep on doing this all the way across. Now before I turn my work to start on the other side, again, I'm going to double count to make sure I have the right number. So it should be half the total number of stitches I had for my sock. Perfect. Now once you have that, you're going to keep on sliding your circular knitting needle towards the left so those stitches end up on the cord. And now you're going to flip your work. So I'm going to turn my work so that now where I finished my knitting, the toe is closest to me, and where I started knitting the sock, the heel is further away. I also want to make sure I have a free knitting needle over here on the side, because again, we're going to pick up going from the right towards the left, and we're going to pick up the right side of each one of those V's. Now on this side, it's going to look a little bit stranger when it first starts, because it actually starts off with the left side, and then we start with the next right side. So let me zoom in and show you. So now we're basically looking at the V's upside down. So if you notice, it starts with the left side, and then there's right side. So I want to pick up the stitch just below the right side. Then I'm going to skip the left side, go to the next V, pick up just the right side. And I'm going to continue doing that all the way across. And you should finish with one more just right side V. There won't actually be a left side to it. Again, you should have that same number of stitches as half of your total sock stitches. I'm going to thread my work in a little bit, and again, double count to make sure I have 34 for my sock. And I do, so that's great. Now I'm going to slide those stitches over to the cord as well, just because that makes it a little easier to work with as we now take out this waste yarn. So the way I like to take out the waste yarn is you can use one of your knitting needle points if you'd like. You can use a tapestry needle, really anything you can use to kind of pick those stitches out. So let me get a tapestry needle real quick. All I want to do is as I'm going along, I'm going to pull out my waste yarn. And it usually is easy if after you do a few of these stitches, if you cut it to make it a little bit shorter, that way you don't have to keep on dragging a super long piece all the way along. Once you're all done taking out the waste yarn, what you want to check before we start setting up our heel is you want to look at these inner corners and just make sure you don't have any stitches that are unraveling. If you do, just make sure you place them on a stitch marker so that way as you start knitting the first few rounds, you can work those into your work. So check those two inner corners to double check. Now I'm going to set this up to the side for a second and explain to you how we figure out, or how I personally figure out, the number of decreases I want to do on either side of my heel. So I'm going to be showing you how I do these calculations using the number I have for my specific sock, but again, I'll show you how you can apply them to different size socks as well. So I have, in total for my sock, 68 stitches, which means I have 34 stitches on one knitting needle and 34 stitches on my other knitting needle. Now for the heel, what we're doing is we're essentially working all of those stitches over and over again in a little circle here. So we again have half our stitches and half our stitches. What I want to do to figure out the number of decrease rounds I need to do is I take half of my total number of stitches and I divide that by 3. And I figure out what the whole number is. So my whole number is going to be 11. And then I figure out what my remainder is. My remainder is going to be 1. Right, that takes me to 33 and then 34. So now when I think about my heel, my goal, if I divide it into 3 portions, is I'm going to put 11, 11, and 11, and then add that remainder to the center. So I'm going to have 12. What this is telling me is I need to do 11 decrease rounds. That way I'm decreasing 11 stitches on either side, and I should end up with 12 stitches left on my knitting needles once I finish all those decrease rounds. So again, what this is telling me is I need 11 decrease rounds, and when I'm all done them, I should have 12 stitches left on each one of these 2 knitting needles. So 24 stitches total. So to summarize the steps, I take half my total number of sock stitches, I divide it by 3, I get the whole number and the remainder, and I add that remainder to the center portion. Now let me show you how I work these decrease rounds and just the knit rounds in between to create the striping pattern. The goal with the striping pattern, and ignore my little opening right there, I haven't actually woven in any of the ends for this sock yet, is to keep the stripes the same number of rows, or roughly the same number of rows as the rest of my sock. So when I was knitting this sock, I found that most of these repeats were about 3 rounds. So on my heel, I'm going to switch colors every 3 rounds. When I start off, the way I want to start off with my work is, again, I'm going to have the heel closest to me, or wherever I started my knitting, and the toe, or wherever I finished my knitting, further away. And I'm going to thread back in my 2 knitting needles. That way I have half my work on either side. This first round, we aren't going to decrease. We're just essentially going to introduce in the new yarn. And as I'm introducing in this new yarn, I also like to pick up stitches from the sides here as I'm going around the yarn, around the circle. And that way I can knit them together with the first and last stitch of either side to help close up any gaps that form. So I have my yarn with my next stripe I want to put in. I'm going to put in this pink color, thread that to the inside of my work. Take my back knitting needle, or the one further away from me, pull it towards the right. And again, I like to pick up a bar here. I'm going to pick up the bar, put it on my knitting needle, and then knit together that bar and my first stitch. I just find that that helps close up any gaps that form. I'm going to knit all the way across this knitting needle until 1 stitch remains. Once I have that 1 stitch remaining on my first knitting needle, I'm going to pass it over to the right knitting needle. I'm going to pick up a bar. I'm going to pass that stitch back over, and I'm going to knit the stitch and the bar together. Now I'm going to turn my work. Thread back in my second knitting needle. Take my back knitting needle that I just worked across, pull it towards the right, and again, pick up a bar, go with that one, and knit it together with the first stitch. Continue knitting until 1 stitch remains. Pass the 1 stitch to your right knitting needle, pick up a bar, knit the bar and that stitch together. Turn your work again. So all we've done there is now we've started knitting the heel, but we should actually still have the exact same number of stitches as before. We should still have, right, our total number of sock stitches, or half on either knitting needle. So next up, I'm going to show you how to work a decrease round. And we're going to alternate between decrease rounds and just knit rounds for the remainder of this heel. The way a decrease round is going to work is first, we're going to knit the first stitch. Then we want to do a left leaning decrease. So we're going to do a slip, slip, knit. So you slip the first stitch as if to knit, slip the next stitch as if to knit, and then take your left knitting needle into the front of both of those stitches at the same time, wrap your yarn around, and pull through. Slide both of those stitches off. So we did a left leaning decrease. Now I'm going to continue knitting across this knitting needle until 3 stitches remain. We're going to knit 2 together and then knit the final stitch. So we decreased across the first half of our stitches. Now we have to turn our work and decrease across the second half of the stitches. So I'm going to do that exact same thing again. Knit the first stitch, work a slip, slip, knit, knit until 3 stitches remain. Knit 2 together. Knit the final stitch. And turn my work again. Now that I've decreased on both knitting needles, I've worked 1 full decrease round. And in total, the number of stitches we decreased was we did 1, 2, 3, 4. After each decrease round, we're just going to work 1 knit round. And you do want to keep on paying attention to your stripes as well. So I've done 2 in pink so far. So my next knit round is going to be the last round I knit in this pink color. After finishing that knitting round, I'm ready to work my decrease round. But I have to move past the rest of this pink yarn. So all I'm going to do, and I find this is a little bit easier at the beginning, is I move over to where my next color starts in my yarn. I take this little bit of extra, I tuck it inside the sock to be woven in at a later date. And then I'm just going to start knitting in my yarn where the next color begins. Now, if you have too much to do that, and that does tend to happen, as the rounds get shorter and shorter, you'll have more and more extra yarn, especially if you're using a self-striping yarn. You can also just cut your yarn, leave yourself like an 8-inch tail on either of the two different colors, and that way you can weave that in as well. I always try to switch my yarn color though at the beginning of the round, just so it's easy to keep track of. So I had just worked a knit round in the pink, so now again, I'm gonna work a decrease round in my new color. So I'm gonna work a decrease round, then a knit round, and then another decrease round in this mustard color. I'm gonna continue alternating between my knit rounds and my decrease rounds and switching my colors every 3 rounds until I've done the 11 decrease rounds total, and I have 12 stitches left on each one of my 2 knitting needles. At that point, I just actually finish with a decrease round, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to work that Kitchener stitch bind off for the end of the heel. Now I finished all of my heel decreases, and I did want to mention here, you can always stop earlier if you feel like your heel is becoming too small, or if you just prefer a wider heel as well. You don't have to continue going until that method that I've set up. That's kind of what's nice about the flexibility of this heel. Last up, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a Kitchener stitch bind off. So I'm gonna cut my yarn, and I just use the same color as whatever my last stripe was. Leave a nice long tail here, and thread it through a tapestry needle. Now I'll go through the steps real quick. If you aren't familiar with the Kitchener stitch bind off, there's 2 setup stitches and then a 4-stitch repeat. I'll also just type them out on the screen. So first setup stitch is you go through the first stitch on your front knitting needle, purlwise, leave it on your knitting needle, and then you go through your first stitch on your back knitting needle, knitwise, leave that on your knitting needle. Now we start the 4 kind of like movement repeat. So first up, you go through the first stitch on your front knitting needle, knitwise, and you're gonna slide that stitch off of your front knitting needle. You go through your new first stitch on your front knitting needle, purlwise, leave that stitch on your knitting needle. Go through your first stitch on your back knitting needle, purlwise, slide that stitch off of your back knitting needle, and then go through your new first stitch on your back knitting needle, knitwise, leave that stitch on the knitting needle. So I'll show it one more time. First stitch on the front knitting needle, knitwise, slide that stitch off of the front knitting needle, new first stitch on the front knitting needle, purlwise, leave that stitch on the front knitting needle, first stitch on the back knitting needle, purlwise, slide that stitch off of the back knitting needle, new first stitch on the back knitting needle, knitwise, leave that stitch on the back knitting needle. So now I'm going to continue going across all of my stitches, and once I'm all done, all that's left to do is weave in my ends. So you'll see there are quite a collection of ends here that I've now created for this heel. The nice part about it is if you have any sort of hole that forms in that inner corner, you can use those ends to tighten it up. But thank you for joining me today as I show you how to work one of these self-striping or just striped overall Afterthought heels. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if not, I'll see you next time.